Ryan.
Yes. And so by way of introduction, I'm Ryan Londergan from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and I'm Brownfield Coordinator. It's my job to facilitate the redevelopment of brownfield properties. So that's my job, and this is Brett Stuntz from AKT Peerless. He is the smartest man at Brownfields. Oh, and they took our little name tags here. He is a degree attorney. His name tag said counsel. So he works for a private consulting company dealing with brownfield redevelopment, and I work for the state of Michigan. Like I said, I'm like a consultant in the state of Michigan helping you and communities redevelop sites, and he's private for hire. Any other introduction?
No, so we work with local units of government as well as EQ with Ryan and his group and MEDC primarily. So, and then the development side, of course. So those are typically all the pieces that come together in Michigan for the public-private partnerships that are what we're talking about here.
So the presentation today, we call it like a 101, 201. The beginning, the first part is going to be that foundational knowledge, get us all speaking the same language, help you be able to communicate these ideas to others, whether it's like commissioners who aren't here today or just developers who are coming to town, go through some examples. And then the second half is where we're going to dive into some of those mysteries of brownfield financing, a little bit deeper dive, more information, explore some actual tax tables so you can see how that works. And I know there have been a number of questions. And we're going to bring up some of those critical questions that you guys should be thinking about as people are coming to town looking to for incentives or develop in your community. So we'll get into that. Throughout the presentation, this is custom made for Saginaw. You're going to see a sprinkling of photographs. We should have did like Saginaw Brownfield bingo as you identify properties. So, and I know we do have some folks that are not from Saginaw, Bay City. I think someone from Aranac was coming, but not here yet. On the right, Baker Perkins facility, if you haven't been out there, it was one of the last people probably in that building. On the upper right was gorgeous, and on the lower right is what it looked like after it was demolished, oil all over the ground. You know, it's a serious, very large property you guys are dealing with. Top left there is what we call the Lovely Nails building, corner of Genesee and Washington. And there's probably like 2 or 3 inches of bird droppings in that photograph on the floor. And lower left is just a dry cleaner. So as we segue into what are brownfield properties, what are we talking about? Most people think of, and the federal definition all started with brownfields are contaminated sites, like known or suspected contamination properties, but it's really a much bigger issue and deal. That brownfields, the way I like to think of it is just think of it as properties that are difficult to redevelop. They have some sort of complication, significant added cost to the developer. So Michigan went beyond that. It's not just contaminated properties, but it's also blighted properties, our brownfields. There are hazards, a nuisance. There might be buildings there that need to be demolished. That's adding a lot of cost for a developer. Functionally obsolete properties. Think of a school building that no longer serves its intended purpose, but someone wants to redevelop that property, maybe turn it into apartments, so they need to demolish that school building, get out of the way. And then historic properties. Like that's an interesting one we don't always think of, but if you want to do a historic renovation, there's a lot of cost there. All those architectural details, they don't meet current codes, the elevators, there's asbestos left behind in those buildings. Heating and cooling, energy efficiency in those historic structures are very difficult, expensive costs for somebody to deal with. So those all qualify as brownfields. And then everything owned by Tom Miller Sr. in the land bank qualifies as a brownfield. And then any adjacent and contiguous properties to the above. So if you have just a next door lot, it's all part of the same project, you can include that in your brownfield definition.
So a lot of what we're talking about here is process oriented. So it's what is a brownfield and how do you deal with the brownfield? And to step back a little bit, one thing I think that's helpful to keep in mind is that within all of this, we're talking about targeting resources. So at every step, if you look at where is the funding coming from, it is coming from taxpayers, and often from taxpayers for a specific property, and those taxes go off to do various things. These tools, and there are different tools that Ryan's going to go over, are ways to target those funds and either to bring them back and funnel them into a specific property or project, or to kind of cast a wider net and bring resources from further away directly into your community. So you're looking at properties and you're looking at problems, and you're making decisions about, is this important enough to go through this process to do it, and do we want to take the step to try and pull these resources and to address these issues? Because hopefully they're all economic development tools, so that the money that's spent on those is well spent, and it rises the tide of the properties around as well, and ultimately generates more economic activity in your community.
And we're going to go through those resources and how you direct that funding and thoughts. You know, you guys should be going through, we'll probably cover it a couple different times, a couple different ways this morning. This is just the after photographs, what we're all shooting for. Site in Bay City there, Doubletree Hotel on the lower right. But how do we get there is what we're going to be talking about today, what Brett was just mentioning. You know, as more background, the cause, how did we get all these brownfield sites? That industrial boom revolution in America, we all built up along our riverfronts, all the industry, you know, it was a great industrial sewer to send everything downstream. In fact, I think like the first environmental law in America was like the Safe River and Harbors Act of the 18-something, and you couldn't dump anything in the river big enough to sink a ship. It was like our first environmental law. And it's obviously grown since then. And then early on, you know, the laws were quite strict. You bought a contaminated property, you bought the responsibility to clean it up. That caused sites not to change hands. Banks didn't want to loan money on it. And we ended up with brownfields, idle properties. Other causes of brownfields could be those, you know, historic buildings that people are just too expensive to renovate. Of course, the economy, those social economic changes. We're reliant on one big industry. They move. You know, we're all familiar with those causes. In Saginaw, Michigan, though, we have solutions. We have tools to deal with these environmental issues. Michigan was definitely a leader, even above, in front of the federal government, developing solutions to brownfield properties. Environmental law, as far as that liability of purchasing contaminated sites, you could now buy a contaminated property but not take over the responsibility to clean it up, as long as you identified it first. You just have to make sure the property is safe for your reuse. Michigan developed a number of incentives to deal with brownfield properties. I think a lot of these came under Governor Engler, and I can't remember what the quote was I had from him at one time, but it was something along the lines like, it's hard to imagine a revitalized Michigan without, you know, revitalizing these brownfield properties, and put a lot of these tools and incentives in place. So it's good to know that, and Michigan was kind of obligated. You know, we have a lot of this industrial property that's gone vacant and empty, so we had to be innovative. The who's who, besides for the folks there in the photograph, it's everybody here in this room. You know, the who's who of Brownfield redevelopment, the local government, state government. You know, we're providing policy, but we're bringing those incentives, public money, to the table. And of course, we want the developers or the drivers of bringing that private investment. That's really who we're looking for. Guidance and help is that bottom group. In Saginaw, you're very blessed with Saginaw Future. They do a lot of work, you know, that groundwork going on behind the scenes, working with developers. But the environmental consultants, attorneys are there to guide through the process, as well as, we'll say over and over, like the DEQ staff, MEDC staff are there to just help you through this process. And we should know benefits. Why are we, you know, why go through all this? Why are we diverting public funds to deal with brownfield properties? Like Brett was just saying, it's an economic development tool.
And you think about what happens if we don't? The legacy that we have from when a big industry moves away, or if there is a significant environmental issue, and even if there is a liable party, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not impacting other areas and that it's being addressed always the way it should be. But very often, it's impossible to find liable parties, and so there's a public cost to that. And when environmental issues become very significant problems, the costs are very, very high. But beyond that, if we're not reusing sites, if we're not redeveloping our urban cores, then we have additional infrastructure costs with sprawl and with air pollution and other types of environmental pollution. So there is a public cost no matter which way we go. And so hopefully this is a way to be more strategic about it, more thoughtful about it, and more productive in the use of our public funds.
The three most important benefits: jobs, 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 always comes up. That's what we're looking for. But in Saginaw, like in downtown, you guys have some great examples of the multiplier effect where, one site gets redeveloped and the nearby properties start getting redeveloped and growing, like Bancroft, Eddy, I'm thinking over there, and then the Saginaw Marketplace, Delta College, just kind of, this is what you're going for. You kind of keep growing. Reusing the infrastructure, you don't want to be installing new water sewer lines to a brand new green site out in the edge of town when you want to reuse where you already have services. Oh, and restoring like those historic architectural beauty of those buildings. That's we all like looking at those. That's an important benefit as well. Oh, and why is DEQ involved? We're all about protecting human health and the environment, but when brownfield sites are addressed and cleaned up, those environmental conditions are usually addressed at the same time. So human health and the environment is protected. And I threw our mission statement right up there. As you can see, it says a vibrant economy right in our mission statement. So we're all about protecting human health and the environment and contributing to the economy. So it's a win-win, and why we have staff like myself, that this is the whole entire focus of our job. And the reality, like I said, they're just sites with development complications, very low to no return on investment for developers. Example would be like the Michigan Works property over there. The Shaheens did that. That had some brownfield incentives in it, and I think the total cost of development was say $3 million, but he had an additional $1 million on top of that to deal with brownfield conditions, demo, very large deep basements full of water, contamination. So all those added costs, like that makes no financial sense, for a developer to tackle.
And no financial sense for a bank to lend on. So for developers going into the property, they're generally looking at an equity piece and a debt piece. And so their bank is generally looking for them to maximize their equity piece in the development. But the bank is going to want to lend on a vertical development that can cash flow. It's not going to want to lend on doing asbestos abatement to prepare for demolition of an old structure and then cleaning up contamination on the property, because ultimately that's not really going to cash flow for them. So that makes the equity piece a lot harder for a developer. And so then when if and when they can construct a development, get it up and get it cash flowing, their returns are eaten up by what they've had to put in to address the brownfield conditions. So these tools really do help a lot to alleviate those issues and to remove some of the hurdles.
And this next slide is just like a quick back of napkin what a developer might go through comparing two different sites. Like Brett was just saying, when you're the brownfield site on the left there's all these added environmental costs a developer might have to tackle. In this example, there's asbestos demolition. They have to remove some old buildings. In either case, the developer's going to have the same construction cost. They're going to build the same building when they're choosing between this clean greenfield site versus the brownfield site. And the land purchase, as you guys know, like say it's a municipally owned site, you often give the property away for free, $1 as an incentive to get the developer to move to the brownfield. But even in this case, it's still significantly more expensive to tackle that brownfield property. And so we wanted to touch on like what developers are thinking, like Brett's been kind of saying, that they have options, you know, and you gotta capture their attention. You know, time is money, they're go, go, go. They need to make a decision. So, you know, that's one reason we're here today, so you guys can be able to like speak their language. Like, not only are you selling the merits of the project, you know, the specific site in your community, but you're selling the fact that you guys can help them through this process, that you can bring the tools to the table. You know, your commission, you have an active Brownfield authority that can help them through this process. Because you're competing with other communities, you're competing with other states. You know, Saginaw Future would tell you, probably every developer that comes to town says they have multiple options. You know, you're one of multiple choices.
And that's huge, because if you think about developers and they have their own limited resources and they can invest really anywhere they want, they're going to stay away from the more difficult properties unless there are other reasons. They might have some kind of specific public interest for working in their communities, let's say. But the ability of the local unit of government or Saginaw Future or other types of entities to shepherd projects through the processes is really huge for developers, because otherwise it slows them down. And for them, that's probably one of the worst things in the world, really. So the more information, the clearer the presentation is, the smoother the process is. These things take months to get through these public processes. Then the more realistic and attractive it's going to be as an option for redevelopment.
Brownfield sites always cost more, they take longer, and they're almost always way harder than you think when you start. And like I said, time, it always adds time. You know, if you want to go after some of these incentives, it takes time to process them, it takes time to work on tax capture, which we'll talk about. So,
and what we often do is, you know, a development is going to go through a community regardless in terms of site plan approval, and sometimes there are zoning issues, but there's always some level of public process and public approval to build anything. So if we can twin those processes and bring them through at the same time, then a developer is always used to the site plan portion of it. So if we're adding on some kind of public process for Brownfield and really pair the two, then it doesn't add a whole lot of time, but it adds complication.
So how do we capture their attention, bring them to your site? Brownfield donuts doesn't hurt. Those are real donuts from, I think, the Saginaw Marketplace construction trailer. So I took that photo. Those are real Brownfield donuts. But incentives.
we have lab donuts. The environmental labs always bring donuts on as well.
Incentives are everywhere. Like at home, I bribe my kids with candy to get them to do something. Consequences if they don't. You know, the library has a fine if you don't return your book. The stores have a sale to get you to come in there. And I put the quote there from the book for economics: incentives are the cornerstone of economic life. So this portion, we're going to talk about some of those specific incentives that you can provide. How do you get someone to move into the site on the left? You know, you want to bring that developer, encourage them to use that site. You can see, you know, it's got a lot of cost complications rather than moving to that nice green field on the right. You know, you as the city, county, you don't want to be installing new water and sewer lines, servicing a new area when you have all these other sites. You know, there obviously used to be people working at the site on the left. Maybe it's owned by the land bank right now. You want to get it back on the tax rolls. You want to get people working there again. So really there's three pots of money. We're going to talk about grants, loans, tax increment financing. And the tax increment financing is going to be really the whole end of the presentation we'll get into, and we'll dig into those tables that are sitting in your lap. But going over like some of the grants and loans that you guys can go for and bring to projects. Saginaw has definitely been a major recipient of some of those through the years. You have a number of projects with MEDC, with DEQ right now. With DEQ, Saginaw Marketplace has both MEDC money, DEQ cleanup money. The proposed Menards project has funding available for that as well. So first DEQ, we don't fund anything that's going to benefit a liable party. We have grant money, loan money, and a bunch of other pots is one way to think of it. And I'm like your technical resource as well to help you through the process, discuss it. If you want a grant, you're going to need some sort of improvement to the economy. You know, new investment, jobs. Loan is much easier to get. You know, we could get a loan started today because you're eventually going to pay it back. I should say at DEQ, you know, one of our major pot of money for grants and loans is running on air, like basically almost down to zero. So will there or won't there be additional funding? There will of some sort, but that's still to be determined. And then we'll talk about TIF a little bit more coming up, like I said. We give up to a $1 million grant and loan per applicant. You know, applicants can come in for one project a year, but just because, like, let's say the city came and got a grant from us, you know, then the BRA can come next, or the county, you know, so you're not going to probably run out of entities for projects. Our loans are wonderful terms, 15-year term, 1.5% interest. But the great part is the first 5 years are no interest, no payments. So you can't beat that. And why we have that is people usually pay the loan back by capturing taxes off the new development. So we give you those first 5 years to get the development done, have it start generating new taxes that you can capture and pay the loan back. And DEQ money, we're all about environmental, so you got to come to us primarily with those environmentally contaminated brownfields, which is not, that's what most of them are. And we're going to do, you know, all the environmental investigation, cleaning it up, making sure it's safe for reuse. And as long as you come to us primarily with an environmental project, then we can deal with other things like demolition, asbestos abatement, some of those not strictly environmental activities. And our money flows through the local unit of government. So even like the Saginaw Marketplace, you know, the private developer, SBRC over there, they're the benefit receiving, they're doing the work and they're receiving the grant money, but our money flows through the Saginaw DDA first. Okay, so SBRC does the work over there, whether it's digging up soil, they demolish the old gas station, removing asbestos from the buildings, and they turn their receipts into the DDA, who reimburses them for the work. So how does the process work? First of all, like, we want what you want. Like, we're, at DEQ, we really just want environmental contamination addressed. So if you have a project you like and it's important to you, then that's fine with us. We want to be involved early in the process, and like the proposed Menard site, like, I've only been at DEQ a year, and that was the first thing, like Tom and Joanne said to me. It's like, this is one of the biggest projects on our plate, and there's just been all kinds of complications and hurdles at that site. But we do have grant loan money set aside for that project, and really, the point of my story is Tom came to me one day and says, hey, there's some environmental issues that are, you know, potentially holding up the development, and like 4 days later, we had it earmarked, the money approved. So you can come to us anytime with these projects. It's not set like, you know, once a year, just as you get projects. And like I said, it needs to flow through the local unit of government, but it definitely is there to benefit private development. As far as the DEQ as well, we have other funding sources. Like when everybody gets gas, like a penny goes into an account that does all kinds of things, weights and measures, but also a little bit of that penny is for environmental cleanup at petroleum sites. So that money will always be around. Coming soon, hopefully next year, I think we'll have petroleum-only grant funds. And so that'll be an ongoing grant that we have. Like, I can't stress enough, don't do a redevelopment at an old gas station without calling me. And that's just really the point. Like, we have lots of various resources people aren't aware of, and we can just direct those to help you with redevelopment projects. So any redevelopment that has environmental issues, we just want you to call, and we'll try to work through solutions for you. Beyond DEQ, lots of other resources. Saginaw, Bay City, you guys have used EPA a lot. You know, there's resources from EPA, whether it's the assessment grants, site-specific cleanup. Occasionally we call them just to come in and directly work on individual properties. Their grant funding is very competitive, once a year, like 17% success rate, and we have not had good success locally trying to get those grant funds in the door. Local resources though, like that's obviously like a big key, your first step. And Saginaw has been wonderful in doing that. Like a project that comes to mind would be the Plaza Hotel International Center. You know, we directed a lot of different resources to that project. I know it started using like EPA funds to do investigation, the asbestos survey on the hotel, and the former mall that was all demolished. I think you got county funds went into there, Convention and Visitors Bureau funds went into there. I think you reached out to some foundations as it transferred to the new development. So you're always bringing in all these different sources, philanthropic funds, keep that in mind. Bonding is another idea locally. I don't know if Saginaw's ever done that to deal with Brownfields, but recent example, like City of Grand Blanc demolished this old gas station on their downtown main corner, really contaminated, their biggest blight in the city. They did a $900,000 bond to demolish that, dig all the contamination out, and redevelop it into, you know, a multi-unit commercial. And they're paying that bond back by capturing the taxes on that property. So using that tax increment financing we're going to talk about here in a minute. The other big source is MEDC, and I'm going to let Brett kind of handle most of these, but CRP is mainly targeted for downtown redevelopment. They want, MEDC's mission is a little bit different than DEQ. We deal with contaminated sites. They're focused more on downtowns. You know, the CRP funding, they have their summit, Saginaw Marketplace, but you're never going to get it out on Bay and Tittabawassee to build a Best Buy or anything. You know, it's focused on multi-story downtown. You know, they want residential on the upper floors, commercial on the lower floors, and then their business development program. I think they promised some of that for some of the upcoming proposed, like Menards Manufacturing. That their focus, the business development is about revitalizing industrial or manufacturing sites, creating manufacturing jobs. So they might offer you, for every job created, you know, maybe you get like $10,000 or something like that per job at the new development. And those need to be sustained over so many years. The crowdfunding, that's called the public spaces, community places, been very popular. They'll match you up to $50,000. And that's, you know, not that hard to do. Let's say you want some new park benches, a splash pad or something. If you could raise, however much money you raise locally, the state will match you the same amount up to $50,000. That's been pretty popular. What else is MEDC?
CDBG, so the MEDC administers community development block grant funding for non-entitlement communities. So that's a lot of the smaller communities in the state. And so they'll bring that in similarly generally to CRP funds, Community Revitalization Program funds, in terms of grant and loan funding to help push projects along. The nice thing about the MEDC programs in terms of a presentation like this is that they really parallel all the programs that Ryan went over for DEQ. Their mission obviously is different, as Ryan mentioned. They're looking to invigorate Michigan's communities and bring jobs to the state. So whereas DEQ focuses its resources on environmental remediation or assessment remediation, the MEDC will focus its resources on getting rid of blight. So they'll participate in a lot of demolition and hazardous materials abatement, site preparation activities, because again, they're trying to level the playing field. So they're saying, all right, if something was there before that's a problem and you have to do some demolition, maybe there are other old materials buried in the ground, we'll help you deal with those. Or if they're, because of previous redevelopment of the site, there are a bunch of geotechnically unsound soils, we'll help you with your foundations. And then we also, you know, putting on an MEDC hat, want to build density. So MEDC will help fund multi-story parking decks, underground parking, in an attempt to bring things together, reduce sprawl. And then they'll focus on infrastructure as well. So if you have dated infrastructure in our older communities, they'll use their funds to help upgrade that infrastructure or replace infrastructure. So they'll assist local units of government with public improvements and using the same tax increment financing program that is used by DEQ for those purposes, as well as their grant and loan funds, so their CRP for the downtowns, their business development, their job creation, and CDBG to kind of help fill in the gaps there.
If you want to explore all kinds of different grant sources, funding sources, there's a website, myplace.org, MIPLACE, where all of the state funding sources are available for you to surf around and look through there. And again, for probably the third time, DEQ and MEDC staff just want you to call them and talk through your specific project. And it's my job to figure out which of those DEQ resources would help the project that you have going on, and the same thing for MEDC staff. And I know Saginaw Future is your main point of contact that probably reaches out in Bay County as well, to City and Bay Future.
And MEDC it's good to reach out to them very early as well, just because it's probably even less predictable programmatically than DEQ, because DEQ, I think, at least in my opinion, has more sort of older and more well-established regulations that they're addressing with their incentives programs, and the grant and loan programs are more, they're more specific. The MEDC grant and loan programs are highly flexible, highly negotiable, and the TIP really as well. So if you have a pretty good assessment of your site, you generally know, depending on whatever resources are available, what the landscape is going to be at DEQ. The MEDC is probably going to take a deeper dive into the underwriting of the project, and really, what are you trying to do, and how much do you really need our help? Programmatically, I think DEQ looks at the conditions, and like Ryan said, they're just looking to do environmental things that clean up the environment, things that help the public health and invigorate the environment.
So, some other communities mentioned this, and I promised someone I would show you. Like, some people ask, like, how do I figure out contaminated sites in my community? And there is, DEQ has a website. Just go to Google, type in like Michigan Environmental Mapper. I promise I'll do a real-time demonstration. You click on Environmental Mapper, and there is this interactive website that you can look at all of the known contaminated properties in your community. So if there's a specific site you're looking at, what might be going on there. And just do one into Saginaw real quick. So you just click on the layers, like land restrictions. These are deed restrictions on properties. There's a few brown blobs that popped up there. And then you click on like these first three layers, you'll see like all of these, if you can see dots and squares and stars are known sites of environmental contamination. And you can click on them, site details, click on one. Like if I click on this brown blob over here, it's going to give me the details of that site. Comes up. And like this one's like a deed restriction, and I can click on View PDF, the actual deed restriction. So if someone's trying to buy one of these properties, these restrictions would say what you can or can't do. And this property has a restriction on it. It says you don't dig any holes in a certain area, construction's limited, don't install any water wells, you can't use the property for agriculture. So all those things might be important for redevelopment. So that website is out there, Michigan Environmental Mapper, that can help you know where certain sites are in your community or what's going on. But basically, you click on this, if it's a property you're looking at, click on it, give you like an ID number, and you can call us up to get copies of the file, find out a little more information. Oh, some real world examples how all this works. This might get our minds a little bit on the same page. And I grabbed two kind of obscure ones you might not have thought of, like River Place Shops in Frankenmuth. love it, go there with my kids all the time, and I did not know that it had used brownfield incentives in the past. But, you know, there was a brewery there, vacant, you know, no one's working there anymore. Frank and moved Zender family looking, how can they redevelop that site? Of course, it's a huge cost to demolish that old brewery, get the site prepped. So DEQ used to have waterfront grants. We put in like 2.7 million waterfront grants. City of Frankenmuth obviously put in a lot of their own money, and then they did tax increment financing on the project. But the bottom, like the outcomes, those are the benefits that I think it's good for us to start getting our mind around. You see, the taxable value of the property it was taxed at $600,000 before it was redeveloped. After it was redeveloped, it was taxed at 3.7 million. So you generated that new tax value, $20 million private investment put into the site. And I did talk to the Zender family, confirm that with me. These are the jobs, 87 full, 149 part-time jobs. So when the brewery shut down, no one was working there. You know, now it's the River Place shops that we all like to go to. Another one in Saginaw here, the Lufkin Rule Prospect Pickle. And I threw this one in there because this didn't receive any direct grant funding. You know, no one came to us saying we want a grant to clean up this site, but DEQ and EPA came in and cleaned the site up directly with our funds. So the site was abandoned. I wasn't involved, but I'm assuming it must have been owned by the municipality at the time. Because the taxable value when the work was done is zero, but after, I think there was an interim owner, like an automobile parts manufacturer that fell through, and then it's House Spec Pickle now. But $11 million private investment, 35 people working there last known. But hundreds of thousands of gallons of, you know, like contaminated water, all these leaking electrical transformers, PCBs all over the ground. Those buildings out there were a significant hazard. And I think DEQ spent a lot of money demolishing and removing those. So these are two like big, you know, bigger projects, brownfield projects with a lot, you know, millions of dollars involved. They don't all have to be big. You know, we do a lot of jobs that are just, like Dollar General, believe it or not, uses a lot of DEQ and brownfield money. You know, they just know, they look for those premium corners where there used to be a gas station downtown, and they know how to take advantage of these resources to get that site, get it back into development. So they're not all real big projects, they can be small ones as well. All right, now we're moving into the 201 portion. And we're going to talk a lot about tax financing. Going to get a little heavier. If blood starts trickling out of my ear, we'll switch to something lighter. But let's just skip to TIF. Like, what is tax increment financing, and what it is, how it works? Because I think if I say TIF one more time, I think people are screaming behind their eyeballs to explain it. Stop using acronyms. All right, so this visual, going right to this slide. Well, let's go up one. Tax increment financing allows you to capture the increased taxes after the development took place. Okay, and there's a little quote there from the Act 381, the law that created Brownfield TIF. Is, you know, it's there to finance or reduce the burden of redevelopment brownfield properties, is why it exists. We'll probably try to explain this a couple different ways. I know a lot of you know what TIF is, and it's about, you know, the DDA has TIF, there's industrial TIF, there's different kinds of TIF. We're talking about brownfield TIF. It all works the same. Is, you know, the base taxable value, if a property is worth, like this site here, the little photo on the left, this is a real world example. Brett did this site in Lansing, right next to MSU. On the left, the property was a little former dry cleaner, contaminated. There's kind of those empty buildings there. Let's say the property paid $5,000 a year in taxes, you know, before the redevelopment took place. On the right, there's a bigger, taller photograph. Property's been redeveloped. It's new fancy loft apartments, ground floor commercial. You know, now it's paying $50,000 a year in taxes. So the difference between the original taxable value and the new taxable value is that TIF. That increase is what you can capture. This is their one animation. So you capture that $45,000 a year. And that would go to pay for all these brownfield conditions we've been talking about. Demolishing that old structure, digging out all those contaminated soils that the dry cleaner left behind, making sure the property's safe for the new use. Is it safe for people to live here? And I should say dry cleaners are like the worst. Like the most contaminated sites you can deal with are usually dry cleaners. And I'm gonna let Brett say TIF, explain TIF maybe 2 or 3 different ways, so everybody's on the
I think that's the key, honestly. I mean, I think, you know, there are probably different ways to look at TIF. There are different aspects of TIF that are material in different circumstances. So coming at it in different ways is probably helpful. And I'd also note that we're talking about incentives, and there are really 2 main categories. We've talked about grants and loans, and then TIF operates on the tax side, obviously. So there, within incentives, there are TIFs, which are reimbursements, and abatements, which actually freeze the value. So there's no increase, and there's limited increase, and so there wouldn't be a reimbursement in case of an abatement. So from a developer perspective, you think, again, if you're going into a challenging site, one of these different types of brownfield sites, and you recognize that there are added costs for redeveloping that site, it's pretty clear how a grant or a low interest loan would benefit the project. You have those added costs. A grant is fantastic. It takes those away, and all you really have to deal with is the time and money to go through the process to get that grant. And a low interest loan, a bank is probably not going to lend on a lot of these things. Then you have to find additional equity partners and float the money yourself. So those are very helpful. Again, from a developer perspective, if you look at the tax incentives, so a TIF reimbursement or an abatement, developer is looking at, I get a site up and running, it's generating income, I have certain expenses in order to operate the property, and then I have a net operating income below that, and I'll take that and pay my bank loan, and then whatever's left over is distributed to the developer and the developer's partners as a return on equity. And so a couple things about tax abatements and TIF, because they essentially enhance the operating income of the project, because normally you'd be paying full taxes. If you get a reimbursement of some of those taxes, then your net operating income is going to go up a little bit. Or if you have an abatement, then your net operating income is going to go up a little bit. That's better when a bank is looking at your project, because they're seeing that each year you have more money to service debt and more likely to participate in your project, and perhaps more likely to participate at a higher level. But beyond that, if you go down one level, once you've paid your bank loan for that year, then you're going to have an easier time attracting partners, equity investors, or getting a return on your own equity investment. So that's kind of the developer piece. Developers looking at it as, how do I fund this project up front? And how do I keep it afloat when I'm trying to operate the project? Because if I have all of these brownfield conditions, if I'm sinking more money into a historic rehab, if I'm doing asbestos abatement and interior demolition, truck something, or if I'm just clearing a site and putting a bunch of environmental engineering controls in, how am I going to pay for those things? So TIF is the most common, I would say, tool that we use in Michigan to deal with those costs. And so, let me just go up here so I can point. But so Ryan mentioned there's a base value. This is the green down here is the revenue that's flowing to all the taxing jurisdictions. So you pay your tax bill, property tax bill twice a year, and there's the local operating, there's the police, there's the parks, there's the county, there's the schools. This is collected, and then proportionally, based on the mill rates, it's going out to all of those taxing jurisdictions. So I guess one nice thing or benefit about Brownfield TIF is there's quote unquote no loss to the communities, because what was being paid before is paid even with the reimbursement that goes on during the Brownfield process. But beyond that, there are certain mills, and debt mills are the main ones. So debt obligations undertaken by the local community are not reimbursable under the Brownfield TIF program. So a development comes in, and a lot of taxes are reimbursed to the developer in order to pay for those eligible brownfield activities, and we'll go through that more. But there's an immediate benefit to the community because the increased taxable value that the development creates So, let's say you take a property and it's either of negligible value and you put several $1 million into a development. Although a lot of those taxes are going to reimbursement to developers, those debt obligations benefit immediately. And a lot of our older industrial communities that have been hit hardest as the economy has changed have a lot of debt mills. Detroit is a good example. They have a very high millage rate. I think they're at like 88 mills. About 22, 24 mills of those, so about a quarter of them, are for debt. So even on a TIF project, there's an immediate, very large benefit to the community. And so this area in here, and we'll look at this again, but that represents over time, so year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the developer's reimbursement. So if you say you have a $10 million project and $2 million are for brownfield conditions, maybe for environmental assessment, cleaning up environmental conditions, abating the asbestos, putting in an enhanced stormwater system would be eligible as well. So to the extent that you have, based on the taxes you pay, increased taxes over the base value that are eligible for reimbursement, those pay off that $2 million investment over time. And that can go out as long as 30 years. That's the maximum length of reimbursement under a brownfield plan. Or the shorter value being how long it actually takes to reimburse it. So if you had your $10 million project, you had $2 million of brownfield conditions, and let's just say that the increased taxes, this piece here, the reimbursable increased taxes were $200,000 a year. At the end of 10 years, when your brownfield eligible cost of $2 million has been fully reimbursed, then you're over here, and then there's no reimbursement that occurs after that. But the community or the taxing jurisdictions at that point enjoy the full benefit of the increased value brought by the $10 million project. At the same time, the hope would be, and it's often the case, that the properties around that development see some enhanced value over time because the area is being improved. And a lot of brownfield projects have public improvements. The sidewalks are improved, the landscaping is improved, the lighting is improved, the utilities are improved. The higher density means that the traffic flow is often improved in conjunction with planning through the city. So there are a lot of public benefits that would see increased taxes flowing to taxing jurisdictions, even while the reimbursement is going on here. One other, I think, point of note, and it's an important one, is that these decisions all come from the most local level and they flow upwards to Ryan or the MEDC. So when you're going through the approval process for, let's say, a brownfield TIF project, you're starting with the Brownfield Authority. And so Saginaw has Brownfield Authority, Saginaw County has Brownfield Authority, cities and many cities and most counties have Brownfield Authority. And so there's a review there, and then the local unit of government approves. So if Saginaw County is approving the village or city within the county concurs with the provisions of the Brownfield plan, sends it along to Saginaw County. Saginaw County approves, and then it would go to DEQ and or MEDC for their approval of the school tax fees. So there's this step process of approvals. But for all these taxes here, if you think of it at a local level, and again, it's kind of a funnel where you have taxes being paid off of a property. And so those taxes are always made up of your local operating, your police, your parks, your transit, your county, your state education taxes. So those go from those properties and they're distributed to all of those taxing jurisdictions. But in the case of brownfield TIF, they go out and they come back very quickly into that one property. So this chunk here that's being reimbursed to a developer represents all of those taxing jurisdictions. And if you're thinking about it though, from a community, the local operating is only one small sliver of this chunk here. So again, if you're thinking about it from cost, local community and other taxing jurisdictions, there's nothing lost on what's already there. Sometimes there's a perception with TIF that there's a loss because these increased taxes are being paid back to a developer. And there is a cost there. Sometimes there's a but-for with brownfield developments. Without the incentives, no one would do the development, and you'd be stuck here, or maybe it would decrease over time because the condition of the property worsens. But for the cost of that sliver that's local operating, and generally that's a very small part, or whatever taxing jurisdiction you happen to be part of, all of that benefit that otherwise would be flowing out of the property, and there's a reason for it, of course, it goes to education and all those things. But there's a decision there, and there's a collective decision with the Brownfield Authority, with the local unit of government, with the state, that all of those funds then flow back into that property. And it's a reallocation of funds for a specific purpose to address the brownfield conditions on the site. So when you see these plans with communities coming through, whether you're in a Brownfield Authority in a community, you can look at where are the dollars? Where are the dollars now? What would the increased dollars be? And for each taxing jurisdiction, what would those increased dollars be? And so then you're saying, okay, that's what the cost is. And the brownfield plan is going to outline what the benefit is, and then you can make an informed decision. Is that something you want to do? Is that something you don't want to do? And so it's all really in so brownfield, at least in these tip tables, they give you the roadmap to the decision that you're making.
And just to say what Brett said in one or two other ways, like, so the dark green is what is flowing through to the taxing jurisdictions before the development, kind of stays the same, goes up a little bit. He said debt millages cannot be captured, so if you have a bond out there and there's a special millage paying that bond back, those taxes are never captured. But if the new development pays even more towards that bond, wonderful. And then the other thing he said, like the beauty of TIF, like he said in a couple different ways, that you're getting multiple taxing jurisdictions all financing your project. So not only do you have your local taxes, your county taxes, your state taxes, all of those are coming in to finance your project. And then the other beauty of it, like you mentioned, is that, we can give a grant and they might spend and clean the site up, and then the project never took place, never went beyond that initial public investment. With TIF, all of the risk is on the developer. And you see like the big brown bar there. They spend all the money up front to demolish the buildings, to clean the site up, to get it moving. So if they never make that investment, they never get reimbursed. They're really getting reimbursed with the tax money that they're paying. It's coming back to them over time. So it puts the risk on the developer, and the whole point of it is if they don't make that investment and do that project, those taxes never exist anyways. And I think this slide just kind of says some of those same things over again, that if the developer doesn't make the investment, it doesn't happen. One little side note is that they do allow you to reset that base taxable value, that dark green line at the bottom. Sometimes as projects are trying to get going, the economy keeps going down and down. You can reset that base taxable value once, right, during the life of the plan, which would be wonderful for DDAs, right? If we could reset our base value as the economy has gone down over time.
Well, that's a good kind of distinction there, because DDAs typically have a broad area. So your average DDA has hundreds of parcels in the DDA. There's a base value for the DDA. And so if the entire area then economically becomes depressed, as has often been the case, the taxes paid or taxable value within the DDA could be less than the initial taxable value, and that can be a problem for DDAs that have bonded, for example, and have debt service obligations, or just trying to facilitate redevelopment in general. Nowadays, your typical brownfield plan is targeted at a single property or a single project. So it's either a single parcel or a collection of parcels that are for a single development. And so it's much easier from an approval perspective to look at a project and say, yes, we agree with this particular project, we want this particular project, and this particular project has legs to get going. If it doesn't, then the developer is out the time and money of having gone through the approval process, the project doesn't happen, that's a negative for the community, but there's really no outlay for the community or no lasting impact for the community in any kind of negative way. So the targeted approach for the Brownfield process has some benefits of some of the TIF districts, and you know there are a bunch in Michigan. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them, but there are different types of TIF districts, and for whatever reason, you know, we have I don't know, at least a half dozen laws with different TIF districts and slightly different rules, and it makes things cumbersome sometimes. But Brownfield, I think, is a little bit different because it really is targeted toward individual properties and individual projects, and I think that makes it a lot easier to administer and remove some of the issues and risks that have come up with the ZBAs or
All right.
Yep.
Before we get deeper into TIF, can we back up a couple of slides? There's a benefits of the BRA.
Yep.
mentioned. I wanted to
So
ask
you
about
can't,
one.
yep, you can't do TIF without having a
Right there.
Brownfield authority.
Okay, hold, buy, market, and sell property. Now, on our local brownfield redevelopment authorities, I don't believe we're participating in any of those activities. Could you give us a couple examples of brownfield authorities that are actually buying and or marketing property?
I don't know of any.
I'm not aware of any that are buying and marketing. The Brownfield authorities, if you look in the statute for what, and this is just kind of a sliver of what the powers of a Brownfield authority are, they're really broad, and they can be very proactive in terms of economic development. And so they can essentially act as a developer in a certain regard. They can buy, prepare, and they can acquire debt, and they can, and that's more common. But they can do a lot of things that they don't often do, and maybe because there's just more risk associated with that, it doesn't make sense for a Brownfield authority to do it. You do often see Brownfield authorities take on debt of various types, and then Brownfield authorities sometimes will issue bonds or they'll accept loans from Ryan. But I don't know how many examples are out there of actual property acquisition.
I think the reason probably locally and probably statewide is the institution of the Land Bank Fast Track Authority, which ends up receiving most of these or a lot of these properties anyways because they're tax forfeitures, they're abandoned properties, they're blighted, and the land bank ends up with them anyways. And so the land bank has, anything the land bank owns is a brownfield, but they also don't pay taxes, and then their whole goal is to redevelop it. So, well, I think, and DDAs have the ability too to own, to bond, to do these things, but land bank has a special focus on owning, maintaining, and then trying to turn over properties. That's probably why.
The question brings up an interesting point too, because Brownfield authorities can have funds, and there are a couple different types of funds. There's a revolving fund that a Brownfield authority can maintain, and those are for conducting Brownfield eligible activities on Brownfield properties. So it's restricted in a certain way. But there's also administrative and operating funds that a Brownfield authority can have, and those can be used more broadly. So, you know, Brownfield authority can acquire property, they can also assess property. And so without having to go through the process of putting a project into a Brownfield plan, if a Brownfield authority wants to operate as an economic developer and it has funds to do so, then it can decide to use those funds and spend them directly or loan them to a developer, let's say, to do some of that heavy lifting on the front end. Because a lot of times with, you know, trouble projects that look expensive or difficult to redevelop, you need to get your arms around it, and people are reluctant to go out and spend a lot of money on consultants and architects and engineers to identify really what those costs are. But they can be of big value to communities because once you know what those costs are, those are the costs associated with that property. If that particular developer walks, maybe then it's easier to bring in another one who's better suited to deal with that type of problem.
So BRAs have lots of powers, like you said, and can have a lot of local decision making, can focus development in specific areas, and like you're saying, just getting your arms around a property, assessing it, doing the environmental investigations. developers don't like unknowns. You know, you want to have that property surveyed. How much is the demo going to be? Asbestos going to be? So how do you fund all that? That last bullet point there, the local Brownfield revolving fund, I think we want to touch on that right now. And we were just talking about TIF and capturing those taxes, but I'm going to let Brad go over this. You can capture a portion of those taxes to put in your own local Brownfield fund. Saginaw County has one. The city, I think, has one, but doesn't have any funds in it yet. Saginaw County, so you got to have some TIF projects going to start building this fund up. Saginaw County had a few successful ones, built that fund up to about 1.2 million. So those are funds you can direct back into Brownfield projects. You can do your own loans, your own grants, do assessment. And so those funds right now are being used, getting Baker Perkins prepared, doing work there. I think doing some work on the Behringer building, which needs some investigation for asbestos. You want to explain how Brownfield revolving funds work a little bit more? Or?
Sure. So if you think back to the graph that Ryan had up, and there's the green base, which is the sort of the bottom there, which is what keeps flowing to taxing jurisdictions. That's the nothing change part of it, where what was being paid before is still stays taxing jurisdictions. And then there's the area between the white area, where it says revenue available for capture, between the green line and the sort of thicker green part at the bottom. So that chunk there is the incremental revenue. That's the new revenue that's available for Brownfield stuff. And so that Brownfield stuff can be reimbursement to a developer, and most of it is. But then within that, there are some other pieces that are peeled off before what's left over goes to the developer. So you have that chunk, and then there are, as an authority, you can start looking for Brownfield properties, or maybe you're aware of Brownfield properties, and you can bring funds to the table, essentially what Ryan's doing with their grant and loan funds. It's exactly the same thing. They have a different funding mechanism. They're bringing up to $1 million of grant and loan to a Brownfield project, let's say, because they have the funding for it. Brownfield Authority can do the same thing, set its own terms for its loans, decide how much it wants to grant or loan. So if it can get that revolving fund funded, then it can help out with those projects. And then hopefully other Brownfield projects come online and they fund the revolving fund as well. So you see a few communities like Lansing is a notable one. Lansing, I think, takes 10% of the tax increment revenue each year during reimbursement. It peels off a piece and funds its revolving fund immediately. The downside to that is that it's less reimbursement to a developer each year. So there's the question of, is that enough economic incentive for a project to go forward? It's just a trade-off that you have to assess. Most communities, though, at the end of the Brownfield reimbursement period will reimburse for some period up to 5 years. So again, from a local perspective, it's really, the ideal Brownfield projects are ones where you have enough investment on the property that the taxes go up enough that revenue available for capture is a relatively high amount relative to the Brownfield costs. So if you have a 10-year, again, the program can go up to 30 years. If you have a 10-year TIF, that's pretty good. You'll see the increased taxes after 10 years or so. If you can have shorter, great. So it's really, from a local perspective, you're really looking for trying to enhance the development on the site. It's not always a but-for on, can this project be done without incentives, and therefore we don't want to incentivize it. But sometimes it's, can we get a better project if we have incentives in place? Can we get something that is more proactive about cleanup of the property? Can we get something that creates more jobs, that brings more improvement to the community so it does a better job of increasing the value of the properties around it? I think that the Frankenmuth one is a really good example. I think it really enhances the area around there. A lot of these riverfront developments where you're taking an old industrial site and you're bringing people in and turning it into a community benefit really do enhance the taxes around those other properties. But that revolving fund there is one of the two sort of funding sources that a Brownfield Authority has. It's got its administrative and operating, and then the revolving fund. And they have different purposes, but they're both valuable tools locally.
And that white box, that's the new taxes created. That's kind of the pie, and everybody wants their piece of the pie. Like Brett was saying, as the Brownfield Authority in the local community, you decide how you want to slice that pie up. More, and you can even, something we didn't talk about, that base taxable value, you can even bump that halfway up, right? Like if you don't want to give up all the new tax revenue, you can keep some of that as well.
Yeah, effectively. I mean, you can decide, and certain communities will do this, that there's a pass-through to the taxing jurisdiction. So, it is a public process, and it's a collective decision. And so, sometimes a community will say, all right, we understand that there's that green chunk down there, and it increases a little bit, and there's nothing lost. But we want to see some kind of immediate gain. So in this case, instead of 100% of that white box going to, for purposes of discussion, going to a developer for reimbursement, they can say, the local unit of government can say, we're going to let 50% of that increase flow back to the taxing jurisdictions, and you only get half. So the developer will take twice as long to get reimbursed, but there will be an immediate benefit to the taxing jurisdictions, which effectively takes that green base halfway up. So it's a flexible tool. It's targeted at specific developments, and it really is something that you just have to look at the dollars. There's a cost and a benefit to the community for the project, and you can assess what that is and then act accordingly. And generally, an authority will have policies and procedures that outline its sort of standard operating procedure and give the authority board members guidance for how to go through those processes.
And that's what, in the last 10-15 minutes, definitely plenty of interaction. Feel free to ask questions. But I threw this slide here right in the middle, like a TIF, because we wanted to make sure, like Brett's been saying, like what are those questions and thoughts that you guys should be having? Are there criticisms out there about TIF? Definitely. And one way to think of TIF is you're borrowing against your future tax revenue to finance this development. Okay? And a lot of the criticism all centers around where it's used and it's not needed. He's mentioned the but-for test, like, but for this incentive, the project wouldn't happen. Like, that probably should always be there. You shouldn't be using it on projects where it's not needed.
Yeah, and I think that that's why MEDC often gets more involved in underwriting of projects, because I speak for Ryan, I guess, here, but it seems to me like DEQ has made a decision that they have certain standards, and they've identified levels of contamination that are acceptable or not acceptable for protection of human health and the environment. And so if you do an assessment, you can identify, look, we have exceedances in these areas and they're threats to human health and the environment. It's very easy for DEQ to say, okay, well, there's a public benefit to using these funds to address this issue. It's a little bit harder, I think, where a developer might come and say, look, I've got a tough time making this thing cash flow, and the market is tough, and the rents are tough, and the general costs of developing it are tough, so you should come in and you should help me. And that requires MEDC to wade in a little bit and look at the sources and uses of the project, look at a pro forma of the project, and see if they really agree or they don't agree. But the nice thing with DEQ from the development side is that there's clear policy, and there are statutes with criteria that identify issues, and there are programs. Let's say it's $200,000 a year if DEQ or if the state is involved, if the locals are involved, and let's say that's 50-50. So if the state is not involved and you're only getting $100,000 a year, it's 20 years of reimbursement to get the $2 million back, which means that the local community doesn't see a bump in its taxes for 20 years versus 10 years if the state's involved. Sometimes there's a concern that, well, we're going to lose out on school funding if we get the state involved because these are school taxes. But for the benefit of the Brownfield program, or just in campus in general, but the reimbursement to the developer from the school taxes does not come out of the local community's school taxes. So the school aid fund will make the communities whole, and the pupil funding at the local level is therefore unaffected by the participation of the state. So your dollars will go further if you get the state involved. And so, state doesn't always want to get involved. There are brownfield eligible activities. You could do a big box store if you wanted to with local funds. State is probably not going to participate, or at least, MEDC is not going to participate, or MEDC likes to participate in economic development projects that are in downtowns, not so much, outside of high density areas, and they might, but they're more reluctant to. So you can always do a local plan in those areas, but you just can't leverage the state school tax revenue on those. But where you can, and that's another good reason to talk early to the state agencies, you will benefit more because you'll siphon in more taxes from further away to help benefit your own specific site here in your own community.
So what can you pay for with TIF? Of course, any kind of environmental work, demolition, some unique ones you might not think of, or just, you can pay for those fees to run your BRA, you can capture that. Attorney fees, consulting fees, stuff you don't think of, but those public infrastructure improvements for qualified communities, which Saginaw is, you can do, if you need new water, sewer lines, sidewalks. Brett's probably been involved where the city wanted new landscaping done. That would all be captured and paid back to the developer through TIF. Underground parking, like I said, is a unique one you didn't think of. For that, they want infill development in cities, so that's something to think about with TIF.
Green stormwater, or a lot of urban stormwater, green stormwater, those are all TIF eligible costs.
And so remember, you gotta have your brownfield, your TIF capture plan approved before you start working. But people are always asking, well, can I look back? I've already spent some money on the project. The only look back is here on this slide, is for those assessments and investigations you need to, really you're preparing cost, investigating the site, trying to learn more about it. That's what you can look back, and you can do those activities up front and capture them. And you can always capture the state school taxes for these activities. That's kind of like in the weeds detail. Like, you don't even need to come and ask my permission to capture school taxes to pay this stuff. So you can do a local only and whatever.
Oh, sorry. Well, MEDC has, they have the ability to look back on all of their activities, but I think it's not a situation you really wanted to get into. You would nonetheless really want to get a brownfield plan in place first and be talking to them. Statutorily, they can do it, but they would much prefer that you go through the processes first. And frankly, from a developer perspective, if you are moving ahead without those approvals, locally and at the state, sometimes it might give someone cause to wonder if that is actually really a necessary incentive. Sometimes projects are such that there's really no way around it. But the easiest rule to remember there is, again, just talk to the local unit of government and the state as early as possible in the project, and you can lay out timelines and processes, and then you won't miss any of the steps.
And so, like I said, half the state education tax gets peeled off to a brownfield revolving fund. Don't get too excited about that. There's like hardly any money in it for some reason, but sooner or later there will be. We'll start loaning that out. And then the key points about TIF, I think, was just kind of going over some of those benefits again, which I think we've really covered. Putting the responsibility on the developers, most common tool you're going to have. You can address all the different brownfield conditions where some of the grants and loans box you into only certain activities. And then like those local only plans or capturing local taxes, you guys can just, it's a completely local decision, and you have a lot of autonomy and freedom. It's an important point. We were going to talk a little bit about the process, how it works, but basically I think we've kind of covered that. The local brownfield plans, the BRA reviews it, approves it. They send a recommendation to county commission or city commission, who then passes a resolution. Your plan's done. Developer can move forward. You get the state involved. You do it all over again. There's really, this plan's here, or slides here, so you can hear the terminology. There's two different things. You have to prepare the local tax capture is called a brownfield plan, and then when it goes to the state, it's called a 381 work plan, which I brought a couple of them here today if you guys want to flip through them. And they're really the same thing, except for the Brownfield plan, what you guys are gonna see and pass locally is much more general and broad. It's usually prepared by the environmental consultant for the developer, and it's gonna have a lot of estimates, like generalized, this is the work we think we're gonna have to do, it's gonna cost about this much. It's gonna be very general to allow some flexibility, because it's usually done earlier in the process. Once that you go to get those state taxes, that plan, called 381, because that's the law that it comes from, that's going to be a lot more detailed. The state's going to want to delve into the detail, like the DEQ, we want to know what exactly are these activities that you're doing. You know, you're digging up how much soil, why are you digging up, and we're going to dig into those details about the plan. And Brett does a lot of this at the local level. Any more thoughts that they need to?
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, what's the additional cost when you transfer from a brownfield to a 381 work plan? What's the additional cost of the developer? And two, when does it happen? When could the decision, or can the decision be made to try a 381 work plan?
Usually make the decision early that we want to go for both local taxes and the state, but it is a process. You start at the local level, it has to be passed, and then when it goes to the state, like this is a 381 work plan. One of the attachments, like an entire attachment, is the Brownfield plan that's passed and has a resolution in there. So you decide early, but it adds a couple more months to the process because you spend a couple months or a month approving it locally, and then you spend another month or two approving it at the state level.
Before the plan is undertaken, then it's got to be given the 381 designation.
Yeah, you're gonna want that. Before you can do those activities, you need the state approval. You'll get a letter from us saying it's approved, and then you can start the work. The cost is usually about the same for each plan that I see that the consultants charge anywhere from like $2,000 to $15,000 to prepare a plan, local plan and the state plan. So it could cost as much as $30,000. But on a major development, it's worth it for the developer to undertake that cost. And they, of course, can get reimbursed for that cost through the TIF capture.
What percentage, in your estimation, of the brownfield plans also have a 381 work plan attached?
Have?
I'd say even higher. I mean, it's pretty high because the benefit is big, and there's really, the reason why you wouldn't would be if the state won't support it for some reason, and that's usually more on the MEDC side, where they're saying maybe it's too far out of the city's core for us to want to participate or something like that. Or at a local level, you have much more flexibility on look-backs. So if you want to reimburse something, and DEQ has very specific rules that they can't look back until on engineering controls or remediation, actual specific remediation, until that work plan is approved. So if the project's hurtling along and you simply, it's got to be done this month, or half of it was done, 6 months ago, then DEQ can't participate. So if the state's not going to support it, that's generally the reason why you would do it locally. I think sometimes it just happens for reasons that are beyond me, but the benefit to getting that school tax in there is so big that if you can do it, you should do it.
Thank you.
And so as we're kind of wrapping up here at the end of our time, I want to make sure we hit what's important to you guys and what is going to help you. And we can stay longer for one-on-one, but I want to be conscious that people need to run. But we can talk about what you should be looking for in a brownfield plan, some of those elements that you're going to see, important stuff, questions they should be asking that are in the plan.
Yeah, brownfield plans have to be statutorily complete, so a consultant should know all that well, but the law identifies certain sections that have to be in the brownfield plan. But from a review perspective beyond that, there are two big pieces, and one is the list of eligible activities and costs. So all the categories we've been talking about, there should be a table there that spells out, at least to a general description, how much environmental assessment activity is there. how much, response activities, you know, how much is it gonna cost to do what is identified in the assessment activities? Asbestos abatement, demolition, site preparation, public infrastructure. All those costs need to be spelled out. And they may just be line itemed out as nothing more than that in a brownfield plan. Some brownfield plans are very general. But you need to feel comfortable that you understand what it is that they're doing and that those activities are in fact brownfield eligible activities. So on one side you've got the costs, and then the other side is the revenue schedule. And that's kind of like that graph that we keep showing. But that shows if you build it, then the taxes will come and they're reimbursed each year at how much. And so that'll show the projection from year zero, where you're at your base value, and then you build and properties reassessed, and what the projection of the taxes are gonna be, and it'll show the reimbursement of the 10 years over whatever the projected period of time is. It'll show the administrative costs flowing into the Brownfield Authority, the revolving fund costs flowing into the revolving fund, and all of that will be outlined there.
And all this is usually estimates at that phase. We usually work with the assessor, what's the new taxable value gonna be? And it's all put into projections, which we should just open up a TIF table.
Sure.
And we'll which one do you wanna start with?
That's
Just
fine.
the-
Yeah. So this is that first. This is Frankenmuth Credit Union's current project, so Frankenmuth being a non-core community, the brownfield eligible activities are limited to environmental activities, demolition, and abatement. So in core communities like Saginaw, you can also